The first thing they found was bone, not buried, not marked. Just a pale curve half swallowed by mud behind a burned-out cabin frame, gnawed smooth by time and animals. Someone had tried to hide it once, years earlier, scraping dirt over it with bare hands, but the ground here never keeps secrets for long. The rain lifts them back to the surface. The soil breathes them up. Inside what remained of the cabin, the air still smelled wrong. Old smoke, wet ash, rotting pine, a place where heat had once screamed through the walls and then vanished, leaving only blackened beams and a silence that pressed against the ears. On one wall, protected from the fire by collapse, there were marks. Scratches at child height, layered over each other, frantic, looping like someone had tried to climb into the wood itself. No one could say exactly how many people had lived here. Records disagreed, memories shifted, names were crossed out, rewritten, then erased entirely. But everyone who stood in that clearing felt the same thing. This place had not simply been abandoned. It had been emptied. Long before the fire, long before the bones, stories had always drifted through the Ozark Hills about families who folded inward, who learned to survive without ever being seen. Families who believed blood was something you protected by sealing it off, letting it circulate only among its own. Most of those stories were dismissed as mountain exaggerations. This one was not. The silence here had weight. It felt practiced, learned. If you're listening to this now, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Somewhere the sun is setting, somewhere else it's still dark. This story belongs to both. The land itself tells you where you are. Southern Missouri, the Ozark Plateau, a place carved by rivers that disappear underground and re-emerge miles away, carrying whatever they've swallowed with them. Old survey maps show cabins that no longer exist, trails that lead nowhere, family names written once and never again. The hills roll gently, but they hide steep drops, sinkholes, and hollows where sound dies quickly. In the early 20th century, this region was dotted with small, inward-facing settlements. People lived far apart, trusted little, and kept their histories oral. Fires were common. Deaths went unregistered. Children were born at home, sometimes without witnesses, sometimes without names. It was easy to vanish here without ever leaving. The cabin sat miles from the nearest paved road, built from timber cut on-site, square and low, as if meant to crouch beneath the trees. No electricity ever reached it, no phone line, no mailbox. According to county records, it shouldn't have existed at all, but it did. And for decades, something inside it grew. Something that learned to walk before it learned to speak. Something that watched the woods instead of the sky. Something that was taught, from its first breath, that the world beyond those trees was poison. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the answers were already braided together, knotted so tightly that pulling one thread would tear everything apart. The first official visit would come much later, the discovery even later than that. But the damage had already been done. The cabin did not appear on most maps, but the people nearby knew it was there. They always had. It sat in a shallow hollow where fog collected in the mornings, clinging to the trees like breath held too long. The dirt track leading to it was narrow, rutted, and deliberately left to rot. Tires sank, engines stalled. Visitors learned quickly that the land itself resisted intrusion. The family who lived there kept to themselves with a devotion that bordered on ritual. They came into town rarely, always at odd hours, always leaving before anyone could ask questions. The man walked a step ahead. The woman followed, eyes lowered. No one ever saw children with them, yet supplies were bought in quantities that suggested mouths unseen. Old-timers remembered the parents first, a couple who arrived before the Second World War and never truly joined the community. They believed the outside world carried sickness in more ways than one. Schools corrupted, churches lied, doctors interfered with God's design. Their children were taught at home, not with books so much as repetition. What was pure stayed close, what was dangerous stayed out. When the parents died, some said in an accident, others said in a fire that burned too hot, too fast. The land passed to the children, brother and sister, alone together in a belief system that had never allowed space for doubt. Neighbors assumed they would sell or leave or eventually disappear. Instead, the cabin was repaired, reinforced, closed in tighter. Years passed, then more. At night, some claimed they heard sounds drifting through the trees, not laughter, not crying, something in between, a low, rhythmic noise that stopped the moment anyone drew near. Once, a hunter swore he saw figures moving behind the windows, silhouettes stacked where only 2 adults should have been. He told no one. In these hills, you learn when to keep walking. The children were born into this quiet. No records marked their arrival, no names announced from pulpits or printed in newspapers. They emerged gradually, first as rumors, then as certainty. Bare feet in winter, small hands gripping the woman's skirt when she thought no one was watching. Faces that looked too similar, as if the same features had been copied and reused. They did not play like other children. When seen at all, they stood still, watching, absorbing. Their drawings, later recovered, showed houses without doors, trees without leaves, people without mouths. Always clustered together, always enclosed. The man called them strong, untouched, proof that his father had been right. The woman said nothing. Silence had become her native language. By the time the state took notice, the children were already older than they should have been to remain invisible. But invisibility was the point. It was taught, reinforced, a shield against a world they were told would tear them apart if it ever learned the truth. And somewhere in that cabin, beneath the layers of fear and doctrine, bloodlines had begun to fold inward. The first child arrived during a winter that split trees with cold. No doctor was called, no neighbor was told. The woman labored on the cabin floor while snow packed itself against the walls, sealing the hollow shut. The man waited outside until the crying stopped, pacing between the trees with a lantern, rehearsing the words he would later use if anyone ever asked. By dawn, there was a child wrapped in old cloth, pressed against the woman's chest, already learning the shape of her silence. They named him without witnesses. He grew slowly, carefully, like something cultivated rather than raised. He was taught to walk the perimeter of the land before he was taught to count. He learned which trees marked the boundary, which stones meant turn back. The woods were not a place to explore. They were a wall. Beyond them lived people who lied, who stole children, who poisoned blood. The child listened. Children always do. When a second child came, then a third, the routine repeated. Same floor, same silence, same instructions whispered between contractions. Child shared the same pale eyes, the same narrow jaw, the same watchfulness that did not belong to youth. They did not argue. They did not ask why. Curiosity had been trained out of them early, replaced with vigilance. They slept in the same room, close enough to hear each other breathe. At night, the man told stories by lamplight, not fairy tales, warnings. Stories of families destroyed by outsiders, of doctors who cut into people to steal parts, of schools that turned children against their own blood. The children absorbed it all, wide-eyed, obedient. There were rules. No speaking to strangers, no leaving the land, no questions about their mother before the cabin, no questions about their father before the fire. The past was dangerous. It led away from safety. Sometimes the children woke to shouting, low at first, then sharp. The man's voice carried authority, scripture, threat. The woman's voice, when it appeared at all, was thin and apologetic. The children learned where to stand when it happened. They learned where to look. They learned how to pretend not to hear. As they grew, differences emerged. One child struggled to speak clearly, words tangling before they reached his mouth. Another's hand curled strangely, fingers stiff, an extra nub of bone pressing against skin. These things were not treated as problems. They were signs, proof of strength, proof that the blood was holding even under pressure. The children were taught to hide their bodies as much as their lives. Long sleeves, downcast eyes, stillness. When they drew the cabin again and again. When they played, they reenacted rules, not games. When they dreamed of fire, though none of them had seen it yet. They were growing inside a closed loop, unaware that families were not meant to function that way, unaware that trees, like bloodlines, rot when they are never wed to branch. And the woods kept their secret, patiently, as they always do. As the children aged, the nights changed. What had once been quiet instruction hardened into routine. Lamps were extinguished at the same hour. Doors were bolted from the inside. The man began marking the walls with symbols he said came from his father's notebooks, shapes meant to ward off corruption. Circles inside squares, lines cut through names that were never spoken aloud. The children were told these markings kept the world out. They believed him. Screams carried strangely in the hollow. Sound slid down the slopes and folded back on itself. On some nights, neighbors miles away swore they heard a child crying, then stopping abruptly, as if a hand had been placed over a mouth. On other nights, there was singing. Soft, wordless, the kind of sound people make when language no longer feels safe. The children began to act older than their years, not wiser, just worn. They watched adults with the flat patience of people who had learned that time did not bring rescue. The eldest kept track of rules, corrected the others when they forgot. The middle child collected dead animals from the edge of the property, arranging them carefully beneath a tree, convinced there was meaning in the way bodies returned to the ground. The youngest talked to himself, repeating fragments of the man's warnings, like prayers stripped of comfort. Once, a stranger appeared at the boundary, a surveyor, lost, following a line that no longer existed on any map. The children saw him first. They did not wave, they did not speak. They ran to the cabin and stood where they had been taught to stand. By the time the man reached the porch, a shotgun rested against the doorframe. The stranger left without asking questions. That night, the children were told the world had tested them. They had passed. The woman's presence thinned as the years went on. She moved through the cabin like someone already half gone, her body there, her will elsewhere. The children followed her instinctively, pressing close, seeking warmth, seeking something they could not name. The man watched this with approval. Family must stay together, he said. Family must not fracture. The rules tightened. Touch was controlled. Speech was monitored. The children were warned that outsiders could smell weakness. That curiosity led to separation. That separation led to death. Drawings from this period grew darker. Figures with shared faces, trees growing inward, roots tangled so tightly they strangled each other. A house without windows floating in black space. The children did not explain these images. Explanation invited attention. Something was wrong, but wrong had become normal. When you are born into a closed world, you do not recognize the walls. You only learn how to move within them. By the time the truth reached the surface, it had already been rehearsed for years in whispers, symbols, and the quiet terror of a family folding in on itself. The truth did not arrive all at once. It never does. It surfaced in fragments, in the way the children clung to the woman not as an aunt, but as something deeper, older, instinctive, in the way their faces echoed hers with unsettling precision, bone to bone, eye to eye, as if nature itself had begun repeating a single pattern, over and over, without variation. Those who later studied the family tree found that it barely qualified as a tree at all. It was a loop, names circling back into themselves, lines that should have branched instead collapsed inward, generation after generation, until distinction lost meaning. The parents of the man and woman had been related, cousins at least. Some records suggested closer. The fire that killed them erased proof but not consequence. See. When the parents were gone, there was no barrier left, no authority higher than the doctrine they had left behind. Blood was safety. Blood was truth. Blood was the only thing that could be trusted. The children were not told who their father was, not in words. They were shown instead, through proximity, through ritual, through the quiet reordering of roles. The woman became mother in everything but name. The man became something that did not exist in the outside world, a figure who claimed both lineage and command. The children sensed it before they understood it. The body often knows what the mind refuses. Medical anomalies appeared slowly, a finger that should not have been there, a skull that grew unevenly, speech that lagged, thoughts that tangled. Each sign was reinterpreted as strength, proof of purity, evidence that the blood was resisting contamination. It was only when an outsider finally looked closely, really closely, that the pattern could no longer hide. Genetic markers stacked atop one another, compounding, repeating. The probability curves pointed in one direction and one direction only. This was not coincidence. This was design. The revelation hit the town like a held breath finally released. Shame moved faster than outrage. People looked back at memories they had dismissed, recalibrated old unease into certainty. The cabin was no longer just strange. It was obscene, a place where natural order had been bent until it broke. Inside the family, the reaction was different. There was no shock, no denial. The man did not argue the facts, he argued their meaning. "This is how we survive," he said. "This is how we stay whole. The world destroys families, we don't." The woman said nothing. Her silence had become permanent, calcified. Years of submission had eroded the language of refusal. When asked directly, she did not confirm or deny. She only looked at the children, then at the floor. The children, confronted with a truth they had always felt but never named, reacted in fragments. Confusion, fear, a strange relief. Monsters are easier to endure once they have a shape. The family tree had folded in on itself, and in doing so it had trapped everyone inside. The town did not respond with clarity, it responded with instinct. Word spread unevenly, warped as it traveled. By the time it reached the far edges of the county, the details no longer mattered. What remained was the feeling, a collective sickness, the sense that something unnatural had been allowed to fester too close for too long. People drove past the dirt road and did not slow down. Church leaders met behind closed doors, voices low, prayers heavy with apology. Old men who had once defended minding one's own business stopped meeting each other's eyes. The secret had not belonged to the family alone. It had been kept alive by everyone who chose not to see. On the night it ended, no one admitted to starting the fire. The flames rose quickly, hungry, as if the cabin had been waiting. Dry wood cracked. The roof collapsed inward. Whatever symbols had been carved into the walls burned without resistance. Animals trapped nearby screamed until they didn't. The heat reached into the hollow and pulled everything upward, smoke curling through the trees like a signal. By morning, there was nothing left to salvage. No furniture, no drawings, no notebooks, just scorched earth and blackened nails. Someone had scattered salt through the ashes. Someone else had dragged a dead goat to the edge of the clearing and left it there, throat cut, eyes open. No one spoke of it later. Records vanished too. Birth ledgers went missing from the county office. Old church rolls were quietly misplaced. A family name that had already been faint was rubbed thinner still. It was not organized. It did not need to be. Shame coordinates itself naturally. The children were removed before dawn, taken in separate vehicles so they would not see the smoke. They asked where they were going. No one answered. They asked about the woman. They were told she would follow. She did not. The man was taken later, silent, compliant, still convinced that the world had proven him right. That destruction was what waited beyond the bloodline. He did not resist. He did not plead. He simply watched the hills recede through the window, memorizing them. The woman stayed behind for one night, sitting on a borrowed chair at the edge of the property, staring into the place where the cabin had been. When she was finally escorted away, she carried nothing, not a bag, not a photograph, not a word. The town exhaled. Then it tried to forget. But fires do not cleanse the way people hope. They only expose what was always there. The smell lingered for weeks. The land refused to grow anything where the cabin had stood. Hunters avoided the hollow. Children were warned not to wander there. Something had been broken open, and no amount of ash could seal it again. Years passed before anyone went looking for the truth on purpose. By the early 1980s, the story had thinned into rumor, then into absence. The land where the cabin once stood had collapsed back into the forest, trees growing at odd angles, roots twisting through charcoal-rich soil. Officially, there was nothing there worth remembering. Unofficially, files had gaps that felt intentional. It was a researcher who noticed them first, not a local, someone who had no reason to protect the silence. She worked from a university archive 2 counties away, tracing patterns in rural child welfare cases that ended abruptly, with no follow-up. Names that appeared once and never again. Entire families that exited the record without explanation. The county kept microfilm, old reels that smelled of dust and vinegar, stored in a room no one visited unless they had to. That's where the gaps became visible, 3 children, listed briefly as wards, then erased. A man charged, sentenced, lightly released early, a woman evaluated, transferred, renamed. Photographs surfaced next, black and white, poorly framed. Children standing too close together, eyes reflecting the flash in identical ways. In one image, a woman stands behind them, hand resting on a shoulder that looks too familiar, too intimate. On the back, a date, no location, no names. The researcher followed hospital records, birth anomalies, handwritten intake notes. She found genetic reports that used careful language to describe something everyone understood. High consanguinity, severe inbreeding, patterns consistent with repeated, intentional isolation. There were tapes too, audio interviews recorded on cheap cassettes, voices distorted by age and static. Social workers speaking in measured tones, doctors hesitating before finishing sentences, and one voice, quiet, nearly swallowed by silence, describing a childhood where love and fear had worn the same face. The researcher never visited the land. She didn't need to. The truth was already complete, not in any single document, but in the way they aligned, reinforcing each other, refusing to disappear. When her findings were circulated privately, there was resistance, not denial, fatigue, the sense that reopening the story would only wound people who had already suffered enough. She was advised to let it rest, to move on. She didn't, because some legacies do not stay buried. They move forward, carried in bodies, in memory, in the quiet behaviors of adults who once learned to survive in impossible conditions. Children had grown by then, scattered, changed, but the imprint remained. The story was never fully published. It didn't need to be. It lived on in training manuals, in whispered lectures, in warnings passed between professionals who understood how easily isolation can disguise abuse. And in that way, the cabin never truly disappeared. The children grew into adults carrying a past that never fully loosened its grip. They learned how to speak to strangers without flinching, how to sleep without listening for footsteps, how to exist in rooms with windows. But there were habits that stayed buried deep, reflexes formed before language, sitting with their backs to walls, counting exits, distrusting kindness that arrived too easily. Doctors called it trauma. Social workers called it recovery. The children themselves had no word for it. To them, it was simply the shape their lives had taken. One of them studied the systems that had failed them, driven by a need to understand how silence becomes policy. Another turned inward, translating memory into art, images of houses without doors, slowly transforming into open landscapes. The youngest moved more carefully through the world, body marked by genetic decisions made before he was born, yet still learning how to claim space that had once been forbidden. They did not speak publicly about the cabin. Not often. When they did, they chose their words with surgical care. Monsters, they said, were too simple. This was not a story of sudden cruelty. It was a story of inheritance, of beliefs passed down until they hardened into law. The woman disappeared from public record after a few quiet years. Some said she changed her name again. Others said she stayed close, watching from a distance, learning who she was allowed to be without permission. No one could confirm it. Silence had been her longest companion. The man died in obscurity. No interviews, no memoir. Just a line in a corrections log and then nothing. Whatever certainty he had carried did not survive contact with the outside world, or perhaps it did, sealed inside him until the end. The land where the cabin stood remains unmarked. No plaque, no warning sign. Just trees growing where walls once held breath and bone and belief. People still avoid the hollow. Animals skirt its edges. The soil there resists cultivation, as if memory itself has weight. Stories like this are uncomfortable because they refuse clean endings. There is no moment where everything is fixed, no fire hot enough to cauterize what was done. There is only exposure and the long work that follows it. Somewhere, a family still lives off a dirt road that doesn't appear on maps. Somewhere, a child is being taught that the world is poison and blood is truth. Somewhere, silence is being mistaken for safety. And that is why this story matters. Because the most dangerous horrors are not the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that sound like protection, like tradition, like love. So consider this quietly, honestly. What would you do if you discovered that the person who gave you life was also your sister?